got about 90 seconds here till we get going. Feel free to hit me up with any questions over in the chat bar, and I will try and get to them as we go along through the evening here. Hopefully everybody is enjoying this cool, wet spring. I am ready for some warmer weather. See, Curtis asks, he's debating between walleye and tiny Dwarshak kokanee this week. I'm betting walleye would be a much, much better choice. It's kind of early for Dwarshak, and imagine those fish are still going to be a little bit up lake. Not sure what the water releases are on that dam right now, but I just know that walleye fishing is really good everywhere right now, so take advantage of that while you can. Lots of big fish moving up, especially early morning and evening with the spawn. All right, we are at 7 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So today's talk, hopefully everybody can hear me, has good audio. If not, let me know over there in the side chat, and I'll try and fix my microphone on this end, but it looks like it's going good. So today's talk is going to be talking about kokanee growth, diet, and how this revolves around producing big kokanee versus little kokanee. We're going to talk about triploid kokanee, so we're really going to bounce around on a lot of different topics here, but food is going to be the central part of our discussion here. So I'll get the glare out of my lenses there. Looks like Jern's out hitting Dwarshak. And everybody's getting their kayaks out for the first time too. That's pretty exciting. Hopefully strawberries melted. It seems like Utah's just buried under a new ice age right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into this month's discussion. Okay. So we're going to talk about several different things. First, we're going to just start with the basics, just talking about what kokanee eat, and then we're going to talk about why don't more lakes support big kokanee. It seems like vast majority of lakes support kokanee sort of sub 15, sub 14 inches. What could we do better as anglers ourselves, and also to put pressure on state and wildlife agencies to produce better quality kokanee fisheries? Then we're going to talk a little bit about triploid kokanee and tie all of this together at the end to talk about how to locate lakes with trophy kokanee. So I'm a sucker for kokanee over 18 inches, and when they get over 20, my mouth really starts to water. I really have a passion for targeting those really large fish. All right, so as many of you already know, kokanee are primarily zooplankton feeders. So zooplankton are small, tiny animal microorganisms that drift in the water column. They're generally pretty small, pinhead size, up to about a size 8 hook. You can see them with the naked eye. You definitely can see them on a camera. And the two most important ones in all of the studies that I've read are copepods, which is the one there on the right, which is also, there's some species of copepods that are parasitic on kokanee. And the other was cladocerans, which most of us know as Daphnia or water fleas. That's those little pot-bellied guys up there in the upper left image. And they will also capitalize on other food resources such as insects. This includes both aquatic insects and terrestrial ones that fall in the water. Freshwater shrimp, including scuds and mysis. Algae, and if anybody's filleted a kokanee, you know they're usually have quite a bit of algae in their stomachs, and will opportunistically take fish. In some lakes, they even transition to a primarily fish diet. And we'll talk about the implications of that. So let's just talk a little bit about the kokanee food chain. So kokanee, basically, like everything on this planet, are fueled by the sun. So the sun inputs energy into the system, and phytoplankton, there you see in the middle, take that sun's energy and nutrients in the water and convert it into sugars, carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates and sugars are fed upon by the zooplankton, and then the kokanee filter out the zooplankton. But there's another path for the sun's energy to be captured in lake systems, although it's not as important in many kokanee lakes. But there are some kokanee lakes that have large, shallow, vegetative beds or shallow areas, and aquatic vegetation will take that sun's energy up and convert it into sugars, and then invertebrates will feed upon that, and they will eat invertebrates too. So this is the way that the whole system functions. It's very circular. And Wrangler and Angler asks, how do kokanee respond to algae blooms? They respond really positively to non-toxic algae blooms. In fact, there are some lakes that were experimentally pumped full of nitrogen, phosphorus, basically fertilized in Canada to actually artificially increase food availability for kokanee, and it worked until they stopped doing it, and then the kokanee crashed. And if you've ever taken the time to look into a kokanee's mouth, you'll have seen these specialized elongated structures in the back of their mouth along the gill plates called rakers. And if you haven't, you should definitely look at the next kokanee you catch and look at those rakers. They're very distinct, and it's what separates them from other species that look similar. So a lot of times people get confused sometimes with really chrome rainbow trout. I say always look in the back of the mouth. Rainbow trout do not have these elongated rakers, and you can see those rakers in this Flaming Gorge kokanee's mouth. Those rakers help to filter out zooplankton. And I found a couple cool papers today when I was just studying up before I gave this talk, looking at how raker morphology changes throughout their life. And the rakers actually get less efficient at raking out smaller zooplankton as they get older, so they're size selecting for larger zooplankton as they get older. But when they're smaller, they rake pretty much everything out. So that's kind of a cool little feature of those rakers. But there's a bit of a problem that has happened across all of the kokanee's range, and that is mysis shrimp. And this has to do with a concept I'm going to get into called interspecific competition. And I think the introduction of mysis shrimp in kokanee lakes across the West might be the single greatest blunder of modern fisheries management of all time. Like, indisputably, it's one of the worst freshwater fisheries blunders I've seen, because it was just repeated across the West, including in Canada and the United States. So they introduced these mysis shrimp widely into kokanee lakes in the 80s. The original intent was to provide food for kokanee because they are in that size range that kokanee would eat. But there was some problems, and they should have been aware of these issues before they started doing this widely. But one is it was well understood at the time that mysis shrimp are a super important food resource for lake trout or Mackinaw, which are a major predator of kokanee. And additionally, these mysis shrimp directly compete with kokanee for the exact same zooplankton resources. Mysis shrimp feed heavily on Daphne and copepods. And then the behavior of these shrimp, where they go down and hang out hard to the bottom in the daytime and then suspend up, allowed them to essentially evade predation by kokanee. And Lastly, like I alluded to earlier, is they're an important food resource for lake trout. So more lake trout, the lake trout just boom on lakes that have mysis shrimp. More lake trout equals more predation pressure on kokanee. So if we go back to that original Kokanee food chain, this is the happy food chain that we want. When you add mysis shrimp into this equation, they reduce the amount of zooplankton. It's going to cause you to get smaller, stunted kokanee because there's not as much food resources available because they're both competing for that same food resource. And then if you throw a Mackinaw on top of that, or lake trout, you have these stunted kokanee, which are really good eating size for these lake trout. And the lake trout population grows up rapidly. The young fish are feeding heavily on mysis shrimp. And so you get this catastrophic cascading impacts of the introduction of mysis shrimp. And in some fisheries, this 1-2 punch of mysis shrimp lake trout has essentially wiped out their kokanee fisheries. So Flathead Lake is a really good example of this in Montana. In some other fisheries, they've managed to persist and sustain, but the quality of those fisheries has declined dramatically, and you tend to get a lot more stunted kokanee fisheries. So it does beg the question, why don't these kokanee just transition away from zooplankton and eat small fish? And in fact, there are several lakes where they do this, several of them in Alaska, where they have limited competition, or due to competition, they are forced to eat more fish. And this often happens in lakes where kokanee are getting a little bit larger, so 15 inches plus. And they will transition to a primarily piscivorous diet, so eating just fish. But if you look here, here's some photos. This is a really cool study. They looked at the impact of eating fish on the raker morphology. So up top is a normal kokanee that just feeds on zooplankton. The one on the bottom there is a kokanee that's been feeding on fish. Eating fish damages these rakers to the point that once a kokanee decides to commit to eating small fish as its diet, its ability to feed on zooplankton is pretty much destroyed. So it can no longer effectively filter out zooplankton out of the water column. And so that's a very strong diet shift, and they can't go back. They can't revert. Once they've committed to eating fish, they're stuck with it. But it does happen, but not all individuals within these populations will make that commitment. And the ones that do commit to eating fish do tend to get larger overall. So it can be successful in some of these populations. Wrangling Angler asks, how deep will kokanee go after to feed mysis shrimp? I've jigged at the bottom at 40 feet or so. And he finds only that has bows, browns, and cokes. So one of the things that's really interesting about the mysis shrimp phenomena is there are, in some populations, kokanee have adapted to feeding on mysis shrimp, but in many they have not. But sometimes you'll see this plurality in the population. So a really good example of this is Little Bitterroot Lake in Montana. I fished there, and you'll find tons of suspended kokanee at around 40 to 60 feet in the summer, and they're not all that impressive. They're 12 to 14 inches like most kokanee. But if you fish the kokanee on the bottom, there's a sort of segment of that population that has adapted to eating the mysis. They are down there at extreme depths. Those lakes don't form strong thermoclines because they're relatively cool and cold. But I was catching larger kokanee in the 16-inch range down deeper in the same age class. So there is that possibility that you can target larger fish that are transitioning to mysis. But I've also noted that in a lot of lakes that have strong thermoclines, the only thing that's hanging out in the bottom of those mysis shrimp and lake trout, which don't seem to have as high of oxygen requirements, they can handle that more anaerobic environment than the kokanee do. See, Sam Baird was saying that in Chelan, kokanee will feed on mice or shrimp due to lack of algae and thus zooplankton. Is that just kokanee adapting to available prey? Yes, I personally have cleaned many Lake Chelan kokanee and find exceedingly few mice and shrimp in their stomachs, but also most kokanee in Lake Chelan I would consider relatively stunted or small in size. So I'm not sure. I know that the lake trout in Chelan are absolutely stuffed with mice and shrimp. So I know that they're down there feeding on them, but I just haven't encountered that many kokanee feeding on them. All right, I just want to plug really quick. I always do this in every one of my lives, but I really appreciate all your support in the super chat and super thanks. And you can also go above and beyond if you want to and do Patreon or join my community. I am doing some fish alongs this year at Detroit, Merwin, and other lakes with my Patreon and community members. So if you're interested in doing that. But the big news is I finally got my merch store up and running. There's a link to that in the description here, and there's also just like a scrolling bar of all the different products available on every one of my videos. So if you want to pick up some merch, the shirts and glasses and stuff are all shipping within about 7 to 10 days, but the hats are taking like upwards of a month because of the embroidery process is a little bit longer. But been super pleased with all your guys' support. You guys are really making it possible for me to take my content to the next level and really invest more time in it. All right, so let's go to the question about why don't more lakes produce big kokanee? And one of my favorite classes in college was aquatic ecology, and we talked a lot about productivity in different lakes. And we rank lakes along a spectrum from oligotrophic, which is essentially very nutrient poor and cold, not very productive, to highly eutrophic, which is very productive and rich in nutrients. So this is like high mountain lakes where most kokanee live versus say like southeastern United States ponds and lakes, which are super rich, warm, and highly productive. And so I feel like one of the major problems with kokanee is just the nature of the lakes that they occupy are generally on the lower end of the productivity scale. So most of the like really big classic kokanee lakes like Chelan and Flaming Gorge and stuff are actually relatively low productivity lakes. They don't have a ton of productivity. But you will find kokanee in mesotrophic lakes, especially stocked. And when you get up also in sort of the Canadian Shield lakes, where you get these, lakes with large vegetative beds around the edge or even flats in areas, which help the lake to draw in a lot of nutrients and capture a lot of the sun's energy. Those lakes are actually some of my favorite kokanee lakes. I'm going to talk more about that in just a sec. So one of the other reasons why kokanee don't get huge is interspecific competition. So this is competition between species, kokanee versus some other species. And many of these are introduced. So we talked about mysis shrimp earlier. And in Connecticut, a major problem on some of their lakes is alewife, which I have a picture of there. And another one that I am quite fearful of is zebra mussel. They are highly effective filter feeders, which clear out all the zooplankton. Small trout, especially that are put in as fry, will compete for the same zooplankton resources, and whitefish too, in some parts of the range too, are also really effective competitors for the same food resources. But the biggest one of all, aside from just the low productivity of most of their lakes, is that kokanee compete heavily with amongst themselves. So this is called intraspecific competition. And so there's no species that competes with you more than the species that you are. And the problem is many kokanee lakes are overpopulated. this might be in part due to natural reproduction. So I know many natural reproduction kokanee lakes throughout the Northwest where there's just too many kokanee, and thus they're just perpetually stunted. I can give you a laundry list of lakes from Lake Sutherland, Lake Chelan, Yale. Wallowa's headed in that direction. There are Pend Oreille is another one where there are just too many small kokanee, and there's no sort of management. There's no way to manage them because they're just spawning in the wild and producing huge quantities of babies, and the lake gets overpopulated, and there's just not enough food resources to grow larger. And also, in many of these lakes, there's limited predation too. Yeah, green peter is a classic one. I mean, it's like, I feel like I'm fishing for green label herring when I'm there. So it's a challenge. The other issue is overstocking. I think a lot of fish and game agencies, when it comes to kokanee management, because kokanee are so easy to produce large quantities of fry, I think they just have a habit of just putting too many, even in relatively small, low pressure lakes. And you just get these perpetually stunted populations. Chelan's a classic example to me. It's this lake that has a ton of natural spawning production, and they also dump hatchery fish on top of it. It's like, why do you need to do that? Just don't put any hatchery fish in there. Let the cycles go up and down, so we might get periodic production of larger fish. But it's a problem throughout all the states in the West, is this overstocking of kokanee. And the primary reason of this is that, of course, kokanee size is density dependent. And that is just a fancy way of saying that as the density of kokanee increases, the size declines, right? So you have low density lakes, like on the left side of the graph, low density lakes where there's very few kokanee. Say like Lake Roosevelt, you're going to get these giant 20-inch kokanee that grow 4 to 6 pounds. They're really impressive, but you're going to troll all day, and if you're lucky, get one or two. And then you get on the opposite end of the spectrum, you get lakes like Green Peter or Chelan, where they're green label size, but the action can be very fast and furious. But it's also really important to know that the slope of this line is going to be variable depending on the productivity of the lake, right? So if you have a higher productivity lake, then you can support larger fish at a higher density, right? So, and I see a lot of this with a lot of the regional lakes around my house, where they'll periodically have a really productive year, not necessarily low density of kokanee, but just an optimal year in terms of the lake's health, and you'll get these incredible sized kokanee in the 16 to 20 inch range class on very small lakes. These tend to be lakes that are in that sort of mid-range in terms of productivity. So they've got a little bit more vegetation around the edge. They're a little bit shallower. They're not classic deep water mountain kokanee lakes. And this is the kind of kokanee lakes that I really enjoy the most. And one of the reasons I'm very excited about going to British Columbia this year is that they manage a lot of their lakes, smaller, medium-sized lakes, for this kind of fishery, for this kind of average, where, coming into contact with 16 to 20 inch kokanee isn't absurdly rare there, whereas it's very rare in a lot of the Western United States, especially on smaller lakes. BC's really starting to get this dialed in and producing just some absolutely stunning fish. So I'm really excited to go up there and fish, half dozen of these lakes this next summer. So I'll be heading up to the Caribou because that's like the holy land of Canada for kokanee, where I should be catching fish like in this photo here. So how do we create trophy kokanee fisheries? Well, the simplest way that we can do this is just to reduce competition. And the first is to reduce interspecific competition, so competition with other species. And I think the main way, as you know, as people who go out on the water in boats and move around in different bodies of water, is to stop the spread of invasive species that compete with kokanee, either through bucket biology or I think the thing that most terrifies me is zebra mussels. There have been many instances that zebra mussels have been caught at invasive species check stations on the Washington-Idaho border coming in from the east. If these things get into our kokanee lakes, it is going to be terrible. And I've seen the impacts that these things have had on kokanee fisheries in Connecticut. It's not good. They are so effective at filtering the water that they can take even relatively turbid water and make it clear, and they're taking all the zooplankton with it. So I highly encourage responsible drying of your watercraft if you're coming out of water that potentially has zebra mussels or quagga mussels. That is like the most important thing we can do. But also we need to look at towards reducing interest-specific competition, and that is, I feel like we as anglers need to put pressure on our Fish and Wildlife agencies to reduce the number of kokanee stocked in some of our lakes. I think some of them are they're just putting far too many in. If you're going out there and catching fourth-year fish that are lucky to be pushing 12 to 13 inches and it's not a wild spawn population, there's really no excuse for that. Like, just dial back on the number of fish you're putting in there. I think most of us would be quite happy to take home 6 or 8, 15 to 18 inch fish rather than 10, 12 inch fish. But maybe that's just me. We also should be looking at increasing limits where applicable. I'm not sure how much effect anglers can really have on reducing overall kokanee population size, but I mean, in places like Green Peter, you might as well just let people take them home by the bucket loads if they want to, until we can push those populations down a little bit. And I haven't seen it as much in kokanee fisheries, but I would really like to see the use of sterile predators. So I'm talking like tiger muskie or saugeye to suppress kokanee populations that are a little too high, especially in these natural spawn populations. By using sterile predators, you can prevent sort of a runaway chance where, like, if you establish some other predator that was able to reproduce beyond your control, then I could see how that would be a little bit scary. But if you're just using something that you can tightly manage, you can create a new fishery and hopefully bring about a improvement in the kokanee fishery at the same time. Also, I think it'd be a really good idea to ask our Fish and Wildlife agencies to stock more kokanee into our mesotrophic lakes. So those lakes that are, a little more productive, but not necessarily like classic kokanee lakes. But all you need is at least one large deep water basin that they can retreat to during the warm summer months. And you can get some really quality fisheries, especially if you stock relatively low numbers in there. You can produce some incredible kokanee fisheries. Me personally, one of the things that drives me nuts is I have many followers in the Tri-Cities region of Washington. There is not a kokanee fishery within a decent one, within 2+ hours of that city. But there's all these opportunities, I think, like below Potholes Reservoir. There's these deep cold water lakes that are sort of mesotrophic, moderate productivity, but still cold enough, I believe, to support kokanee. I'd love to see some sort of kokanee fishery established in those types of areas, and I think there's a lot of that can be replicated throughout the West. And so one of the questions I often get asked about is how to create these trophy kokanee fisheries is, can we do triploiding of kokanee? If you've never heard of triploiding, it's basically They can do it with any species, but they do it a lot with trout and kokanee. They retain an extra chromosome that is normally ejected after fertilization. They do this through a heat shocking process shortly after fertilization in the hatchery. It produces sterile fish, so they are incapable of spawning. And most of the agencies utilizing triploid fish is not as a tool to create trophy fisheries, but it's primarily to utilize sterile fish so that they do not bring it into conflict with some sort of agency or management goal. That might be to make sure that hatchery strain aren't breeding with or mixing with wild strains, etc. And a really classic example of this is the lake which I live right on is Rufus Woods Lake, and the giant triploid kokanee fishery, or triploid rainbow trout fishery there. Here's Austin Moser, he's up there all the time slaying these giant triploid rainbow trout. And these trout grow to immense sizes. I mean, they're just footballs, especially after 3+ years, because they're not spending any energy in reproduction. They're just growing and growing and growing. They don't have to invest time and energy into gonad development or spawning behavior. They are just eating all the time and getting fatter and bigger. So triploid kokanee have been experimented with widely in Washington State and California, I know for sure. I think it's still regular use in British Columbia, but somebody might correct me. But I read a lot of literature coming out of BC on triploid kokanee, and looking at all of their data from that, they're actually showing no significant growth advantage in kokanee with triploidy. And if you think about it, if you step back, think about it, this actually makes sense, because kokanee don't spawn every year, so they only spawn once and die. So you're not going to get a huge growth advantage versus a rainbow trout. The rainbow trout is setting itself back each time it goes to spawn. If they don't spawn, then they can just keep growing, and you're going to see a divergence between spawning versus non-spawning in terms of size. But with kokanee, you're just not going to realize that advantage. And what they found is, like, even with triploid kokanee, the males still senesce, so that is they change color and die, even though they're sterile. The one sliver of an advantage they have is that female triploid kokanee, their immature silver stage is extended, and so they won't change color and senesce as quickly, and so you can get a little bit of an extended, like, chrome kokanee season on triploid kokanee lakes. And unfortunately, they just killed the Washington triploid kokanee fishery program, but there are a few lakes that got stocked with them in my area last year, so I'm excited to go see what those lakes look like in 2 years from now. So I want to kind of bring this back around and tie this into how do I find trophy kokanee lakes. I like to sleuth and figure out ways I can find giant kokanee that are maybe not on the radar as much. And so I'm always looking for low density kokanee lakes. That is, large reservoirs with small populations. These are some of the more well-known ones, classic ones like Roosevelt and Flaming Gorge, Fontenelle, Fish Lake in Utah. But another type of lake that's really overlooked is these spillover populations. That is, lakes that don't directly get planted with kokanee, but lie just downstream of lakes that get planted with kokanee. So there, you're going to get some outmigration of kokanee over the dam in the spring or through the turbines, and some will survive. And so those lakes will have low, by their very nature, are going to have low densities of kokanee, but the kokanee in there can be really large. So there's some really good examples of this in Montana, where there are lakes kicking out 4 to 6 pound kokanee Rock Lake in Washington State's another one that there's actually really big kokanee in there, but you got to work to find them. But if you do, they will be large. The other one is post-crash population lakes, and that's another way you can artificially get low density. So they're like many lakes, kokanee lakes can go through periodic crashes due to disease, or due to impacts on the spawning grounds. And after that crash, when most of the kokanee get wiped out, those few survivors or their offspring can get really big. This is what happened at Wallowa when it produced record fish, is that the spawning grounds, access to the spawning grounds was blocked. And so there was just momentary decline in kokanee population, and you got these really large age class of fish. There's some other lakes that have gone through crashes around here. So a lot of times when I read about like big winter die-offs and stuff, it doesn't really upset me, because I'm thinking, well, that just means that in a few years there's going to be some decent sized kokanee in that lake. Another thing to look for is low competition lakes, which is a little bit different than low density lakes, because you can still have a higher density in these lakes, but you get the lower competition because that's the first time they've planted that lake with kokanee. So I am, every year when they release the hatchery plant data for all the different states that I have access to that data, I will go in and see, is there any lakes that are newly getting planted with kokanee? Because I want to go and fish that first generation of kokanee that was planted, when they're in age class, 3 and 4, because they're going to be huge, because they've got there's no competition out in front of them. And this giant that I caught here was at Curlew Lake. This was the first year that they were going to spawn in that lake, and there were tanks. I mean, there were 18 to 20 inch kokanee everywhere up there. It was nuts. And now there's still decent kokanee there, but nothing like it was that first year. And then the other lakes that I look for trophy kokanee are mesotrophic lakes, and these are lakes that tend to be multi-species. I actually like multi-species kokanee lakes, especially mesotrophic ones, because you got a little higher productivity and you've got some predation pressure. And because these states tend to overstock these lakes, that predation pressure from bass, pike, or trout, it's going to knock that density of kokanee down a little bit. You have that little bit higher net productivity, and that combination can produce really large fish. Not always, but periodically. And so I see a lot of lakes that fit this bill really well and can periodically produce fish in that 18-inch plus range class. So think about that when you're looking at the different kokanee lakes that you're going to go scout out to fish this year. Don't always be so heavily focused on those pure kokanee fisheries. Look for those fisheries where kokanee are just one aspect of the fishery, especially if it's a fairly productive lake, a more shallow lake. Okay, that brings it all together. I hope you guys enjoyed this evening's talk about Kokanee Diet, and then how that relates to everything about kokanee growth and ways to help inform you to find lakes with big kokanee. If you have any questions about this video that you didn't get to in the chat, just let me know below in the comment section once it gets uploaded. And if you missed the live version, I'll respond to those comments below. And I appreciate all of your support, and hopefully we'll be able to get out on the water, start chasing those cokes as our lakes start to thaw and warm up in the next few weeks. And I'll see you out there. So just remember, fish smarter, not harder. Bye guys, and have a great evening.